She was 25 years old, and she had made herself a promise. Not the kind of promise you whisper and forget by morning, the kind you carve into yourself, the kind you repeat on hard nights when you need something solid to hold on to. Clara Whitmore had promised herself at 17 years old, standing in the doorway of her mother's bedroom, that she would never, not ever, give her heart to a man older than her by more than a handful of years. Do you know what it does to a girl, watching her mother fade a little more each year beside a husband who treated her like furniture? Do you know what it teaches her about love and about waiting and about the quiet kind of grief that never gets a funeral? Clara knew. She had lived it. So when she rode into the town of Larkspur Hollow, Montana Territory, in the spring of her 25th year, she carried that promise with her the way other women carried a locket or a Bible. It sat close to her heart. It was not for sale, not for a smile, not for a kind word, not for anything. She was beautiful. There was no use pretending otherwise, and the whole town noticed within her first week. Golden hair that caught the prairie light like something spun rather than grown, eyes the color of a July sky, and a way of carrying herself that made men forget what they'd been about to say. Her dresses were simple by necessity. She wasn't a wealthy woman, but she wore them the way some women wear silk, fitted close, unapologetic, as if her body had never once been told to apologize for existing. And still, she had made her promise. Now picture this town, if you would. Larkspur Hollow was not much. A mercantile, a church with a bell that rang crooked, a saloon that behaved itself on Sundays, and streets that turned to red mud whenever it rained. But it had heart. It had the kind of community where everyone knew your business before you'd finished thinking it yourself, and it had him. Thomas Calloway was 44 years old, a rancher, a widower for going on 6 years, having buried his wife Margaret after a fever took her in a single terrible week. He kept to himself mostly. He ran 300 head of cattle on land that stretched clear to the foothills, and he did it with his own 2 hands because he trusted very few others to do it right. The town had opinions about Thomas Calloway. The women thought him handsome in that weathered, sun-worn way, broad shoulders, a quiet voice, hands that had done honest work every day of his life. The men respected him because he never cheated a deal and never raised his voice unless a voice needed raising. The children liked him because he always had peppermint candy in his coat pocket, though nobody quite knew why a man with no children of his own bothered to carry it. But nobody expected Clara Whitmore to fall for him, least of all Clara. She had come to Larkspur Hollow to take a position as the new schoolteacher, replacing a woman who'd married and moved east. It was steady work, respectable work, and it gave her a small house near the schoolhouse and a life entirely her own, which was exactly what she wanted. No husband looking over her shoulder, no man's name attached to hers. Just Clara, her books, and 31 children who needed teaching. She told herself that was enough. Isn't it strange, the things we tell ourselves are enough right up until the moment life proves us wrong? It happened on a Tuesday. She would remember that forever. A Tuesday, ordinary as bread, the kind of day nobody expects to change the shape of their whole life. One of her students, a boy of 8 named Daniel, had a habit of wandering. That particular afternoon, he wandered clean off the schoolhouse grounds and down toward the creek that ran along the edge of Calloway land, chasing after a dog that wasn't even his. Clara went after him, her skirts gathering mud, her heart hammering with the particular fear that belongs only to people responsible for children who are not their own. She found Daniel standing at the creek's edge, perfectly safe, perfectly unbothered, throwing stones at the water. And she found Thomas Calloway crouched right beside him, having apparently intercepted the boy first, showing him how to skip a flat stone across the surface. "He's all right," Thomas said before she could even catch her breath to scold anyone. "Found him 20 minutes ago. Figured I'd let him tire himself out some before I walked him back. Clara stood there, chest heaving, mud on her hem, absolutely furious and absolutely relieved in equal measure. And Thomas Calloway looked up at her with an expression that wasn't mocking, wasn't pitying, just steady. Like he understood exactly what she'd been afraid of and didn't think less of her for it. "You must be the new teacher," he said. "Clara Whitmore." She said it clipped, businesslike, the way she said most things to men. Thomas Calloway. He stood, brushing off his knees, and held out a hand, not to shake hers, but simply offered, waiting to see what she'd do with it. I'd have brought him back sooner, but he was set on catching that dog, and I figured a boy ought to be allowed one foolish chase before supper. Now here is where I want you to lean in close, because this is the part that matters. This is the 5 minutes. Clara opened her mouth to say something sharp, something about responsibility, about not encouraging children to run wild near the creek, and instead she found herself asking him why he thought that. Why a boy ought to be allowed one foolish chase. And Thomas Calloway, this man twice widowed by silence and grief, this man 19 years her senior, looked at her like the question actually mattered to him. And he answered her, truly answered her, about how a life without a little foolishness in it wasn't much of a life at all, about how he'd learned that the hard way, about how his wife Margaret used to say the same thing before every harvest dance, dragging him out onto a floor he had no business dancing on. He talked about grief without flinching from it. He talked about joy the same way, plainly, honestly, like both were simply facts of a life well lived rather than wounds to hide. 5 minutes. That's all it took. 5 minutes standing at a muddy creek bank with a runaway student between them and Clara Whitmore, who had promised herself, who had built walls out of her mother's sorrow, felt something crack clean down the middle of her carefully guarded heart. Isn't that always how it happens? Not in the grand gesture, not in the poetry, but in 5 plain minutes where somebody sees you clearly and you can't quite look away. She walked Daniel back to the schoolhouse in silence, her mind racing the whole way, and she told herself firmly, the way she told herself most things, that it meant nothing. A conversation, a kindness. That was all. Before we go further into Clara and Thomas's story, I want to ask you something, because I have a feeling a good many of you watching this have your own version of this story tucked away somewhere. Maybe it wasn't an older man. Maybe it was someone your family disapproved of, or someone you swore you'd never let close, or a promise you made to yourself in a moment of pain that life later asked you to break. Tell me about it down in the comments. I read every single one, and I promise you, your story matters just as much as Clara's. And if stories like this one, the quiet, aching, honest kind, mean something to you, do me a kindness and subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means the world to a small channel trying to tell stories worth telling. Now, back to Larkspur Hollow. The weeks that followed were an exercise in Clara's own stubbornness. She avoided the Calloway ranch entirely, took the long way around town to skip past his usual haunts, and buried herself so deeply in lesson plans that even her students noticed her distraction had a name, even if they didn't know whose. But Larkspur Hollow was a small town, and small towns have a way of pushing two people back together, whether they like it or not. It was the church social that did it. Every family in 3 counties turned up for the spring social, and Thomas Calloway, who normally kept to the edges of such gatherings, nursing a cup of coffee and speaking to no one longer than politeness required, found himself, for reasons he couldn't quite name even to himself, standing near the refreshment table where Clara had been cornered by Mrs. Higgins, the town's most enthusiastic matchmaker. "Miss Whitmore, you simply must meet my nephew," Mrs. Higgins was saying, practically dragging forward a pale, nervous young man of perhaps 22. "He's just taken over his father's dry goods business. Very promising future." "Evening, Mrs. Higgins." Thomas's voice cut in, low and easy. "Miss Whitmore, Might I trouble you for a dance, if you're not otherwise engaged?" Clara looked at him, looked at the nephew, who seemed grateful for the reprieve as much as she was. And something in her, that same crack from the creek bank widening now, made her set down her lemonade and take Thomas Calloway's offered arm. They didn't say much out there on the dance floor. Thomas wasn't a natural dancer. He admitted as much, stepping on her hem once and apologizing so genuinely she laughed despite herself. But there was something in the way he held her, careful and unhurried, like a man who had learned the hard way not to take a single moment for granted. "You've been avoiding me," he said quietly, about halfway through the song. Clara considered lying, decided against it. "Yes. Can I ask why?" She could have deflected. She could have made some excuse about being busy with her students, about proper conduct for a schoolteacher. But something about the honesty he'd shown her at that creek bank demanded honesty in return. "I made myself a promise a long time ago," she said, "that I'd never love a man much older than myself." Thomas didn't flinch, didn't argue, just nodded slowly, like he was turning the words over and giving them the respect they deserved. "That's a fair promise to make, if you've got good reason for it. Mind if I ask what the reason was?" And there, in the middle of a crowded dance floor, under lantern light and the noise of a fiddle band, Clara found herself telling a near stranger about her mother. About watching a bright, funny woman shrink herself smaller and smaller beside a husband 23 years her senior, who saw her less as a partner and more as a possession that had aged out of usefulness. About the loneliness of it. About swearing she'd never live that same slow, disappearing act. "That's not a promise about age," Thomas said when she'd finished. "That's a promise about respect, about being seen as somebody's equal, not somebody's belonging." Clara stopped dancing for a moment, just stood there in the middle of the floor, looking up at him. "I'm 44, Thomas went on, quiet enough that only she could hear it. "I won't pretend otherwise, and I won't ask you to pretend it doesn't matter. But I buried a wife I loved as an equal every single day we had together. And I promise you, Miss Whitmore, age never once made me think less of her mind or her voice or her right to it. If anything, it taught me how short the whole business is and how foolish it is to waste it standing on the edges of a dance floor, too afraid to ask." Do you understand what that moment cost him? A man who had lost so much already, laying himself bare like that, with absolutely no guarantee she wouldn't simply walk away. She didn't walk away. I won't pretend the rest of their courtship was easy, because it wasn't, and stories that pretend hardship away aren't worth telling. Larkspur Hollow talked. Of course it talked. What small town wouldn't? There were whispers about the young, pretty schoolteacher and the widower rancher old enough, some said cruelly, to be her father, though the math never quite worked out that neatly and everyone knew it. Mrs. Higgins was scandalized on behalf of her nephew's wounded pride. The church ladies had opinions delivered in tones sweet enough to mask the venom underneath. And worst of all, a letter arrived from Clara's own mother back east, full of careful, worried questions that Clara understood underneath the ink to mean, "Are you certain you aren't making my mistake all over again, just wearing different clothes?" That letter shook her more than all the town gossip combined. She read it 3 times over by candlelight, and on the 4th reading, she nearly convinced herself to end things with Thomas before they'd truly begun, to protect herself the way she'd promised all those years ago that she would. She rode out to the Calloway ranch the next morning to tell him so. She found him in the north pasture, mending fence in the early light, his sleeves rolled up, sweat already darkening his shirt despite the cool morning air. He saw her coming and set down his tools, and something in his face, a kind of braced patience like a man who has learned to expect loss before it arrives, told her he already suspected why she'd come. "I can't do this," she said before she lost her nerve. "I watched what this does. I watch my mother become smaller every year, and I won't. I can't be that." I won't be the young wife who buries an old husband and spends the second half of her life alone, having given the first half away to someone who saw her as a comfort in his final years rather than a whole person with a whole life of her own." Thomas listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't defend himself, didn't rush to reassure her the way a lesser man might have, eager to smooth over her fear rather than actually hear it. When she finished, he was quiet a long moment. "You're right to be afraid of that," he finally said. "I'd be a fool to tell you it isn't a real thing to fear. I likely will go before you do, Clara, and that's a hard truth, and I won't insult you by pretending otherwise." Clara felt her eyes sting. "But I'll tell you what I told myself the day I buried Margaret," Thomas went on. "I could have decided that loving her had been a mistake on account of how much it hurt to lose her. Plenty of men would have decided just that and closed themselves off for good and called it wisdom. But I didn't believe it then, and I don't believe it now. Every day I had with her was worth the grief that came after, every single one. And I'd rather spend however many years I've got left being seen, truly seen, the way you saw me at that creek, the way I've tried to see you every day since, than spend them safe and untouched and alone, just so the ending doesn't hurt so bad." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of grey at his temples, close enough to see that his hands, work-worn and calloused, were trembling just slightly. "I'm not asking you to erase your mother's story. I'm asking you to let me help you write a different one. That's all courage ever is, Clara, not the absence of fear, just deciding the thing you want is worth walking through it. Now, if you've made it this far with me, I want you to sit with that for just one moment, because I think it's the truest thing in this whole story. So many of us build walls out of somebody else's pain, a parent's failed marriage, a friend's broken heart, our own old wounds, and we call those walls wisdom, when really sometimes they're just fear wearing a very convincing disguise. I'd love to know, have you ever had to choose between the safety of a promise and the risk of real happiness? Write it in the comments below. And if this story is speaking to something in you, subscribing helps more than you know. It tells me to keep finding stories like Clara and Thomas's and bringing them to you. Clara did not answer him that morning in the pasture. She rode home with her heart cracked wide open and her mind a storm of everything she thought she knew about love and safety and what it meant to protect yourself. She thought about her mother, who had never once had a man look at her the way Thomas looked at Clara. Like her fear was worth honoring rather than dismissing, like her voice mattered more than her youth. She thought about the difference between a man who marries a woman to have something young and pliable beside him in his later years, and a man who has already learned, through the deepest loss he'd known, exactly how precious and fragile and worth fighting for real love actually is. She understood, somewhere around sundown, sitting alone on the steps of her little schoolhouse house, that she had been afraid of the wrong thing entirely. She had been so busy guarding against becoming her mother that she'd nearly talked herself out of a man who had spent his whole life becoming the exact opposite of her father. The next morning, she did not wait for him to come to her. She rode out to the Calloway ranch before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge, found him again in that same north pasture, and this time, before he could say a single word, she crossed the distance between them and kissed him. Full and certain, the kind of kiss that answers a question rather than asks one. When she finally pulled back breathless, Thomas Calloway, steady, weathered, 44 years old and utterly undone, laughed, low and disbelieving, like a man who couldn't quite trust his own good fortune. "I take it that's a yes," he said. "That's a yes," Clara said, "to all of it. The talking, the fear, the years, however many we get, all of it. There was one more test before that wedding day arrived, and I think it's worth telling you about, because it's the kind of thing that so often gets left out of love stories. The part where the world tries one last time to talk you out of your own happiness. It came in the form of Clara's own doubt, dressed up as practicality. A month before the wedding, sitting across the supper table from Thomas in the ranch house he'd shared with Margaret for so many years, Clara found herself staring at a small portrait of his late wife that still hung above the mantel and asking a question she hadn't meant to ask out loud. "Do you see her when you look at me?" Thomas set down his fork. He didn't answer quickly, and Clara respected him for that, for taking the question seriously enough not to rush past it with an easy reassurance. "No," he said finally. "I loved Margaret with everything I had, and I'll carry her with me the rest of my days. But you're not her, Clara, and I've never once asked you to be. You're sharp where she was soft. You argue with me about things she'd have simply agreed to keep the peace. You've got a fire in you she never had, and I thank God for it every single day, because it means when I look at you, I see you. Only you." He reached across the table and took her hand, turning it over gently, tracing the calluses that teaching hadn't given her, but that riding out to see him certainly had. "I took Margaret's portrait down twice," he admitted. "Put it back up both times because it felt wrong to erase her, like pretending she never mattered. But if it troubles you, I'll take it down for good. This is your home now, too." "Leave it," Clara said, surprising herself. "She loved you first. I don't need to erase that to know you love me now. I'd rather you keep loving the people you've lost. It tells me something true about the kind of man I'm marrying." It was a small moment, quiet and unremarkable to anyone who might have glimpsed it through the window. But it was, in its own way, the last brick Clara needed to lay down. Not because Thomas convinced her with clever words, but because he answered a hard question honestly, the same way he'd answered her that very first day at the creek bank. Isn't that always the measure of it? Not whether someone says the perfect thing, but whether they're brave enough to tell you the true thing? They married that autumn in the little church with the crooked bell, and if the town of Larkspur Hollow had once whispered about the schoolteacher and the widower rancher, by the wedding day those same whispers had softened into something gentler, the kind of talk reserved for a love story people are genuinely glad to have witnessed. Mrs. Higgins, to everyone's surprise, cried the hardest of anyone in the pews. Her nephew, it turned out, had already found himself a sweetheart closer to his own age and bore no ill will at all. And Clara's mother, after a long correspondence full of careful questions and careful answers, finally came west for the wedding herself and stood at the back of that little church watching her daughter marry a man who looked at her the way she had once, briefly, hoped somebody might look at her too. Daniel, the boy from the creek bank, stood as ring-bearer, having grown rather fond of the man who'd taught him to skip stones and the teacher who'd taught him nearly everything else. Clara Whitmore became Clara Calloway that day, and if you were to ask her, even years later, even after the hard seasons that any real marriage inevitably brings, she would tell you the very same thing every single time. That she'd built a promise to protect herself from a kind of grief she'd only ever seen from the outside, and that promise had very nearly cost her the one thing worth breaking every promise for. 5 minutes at a creek bank. That's all it took to start unraveling 25 years of careful walls. Isn't that just like love, though? It never waits for us to be ready. It simply arrives, quiet and plain and unremarkable at first, in the shape of a kind question at a muddy creek, and it asks nothing more of us than the courage to keep listening. Years later, folks in Larkspur Hollow would still tell the story of the schoolteacher and the rancher, though by then it had softened into something closer to legend than gossip. They'd tell you about the winter Thomas took ill, and Clara sat up 3 straight nights beside his bed, refusing every offer of relief, because she'd promised him years, and she intended to see every one of them through, sick or well. They'd tell you about the 2 children who came along in the years that followed. A boy with his father's steady hands, and a girl with her mother's stubborn fire, both of them raised on stories about a 5-minute conversation at a creek bank that changed everything. And they'd tell you, if you asked the right person, about the day Clara's own mother finally admitted, sitting on the porch of the ranch house years after that first wedding, watching Thomas swing her granddaughter up onto his shoulders, that she had been wrong to worry so much. Not because age hadn't mattered at all, but because she finally understood what Clara had tried to tell her all along, that the danger was never a man's years. The danger was always a man who couldn't see the whole of you. And Thomas Calloway, from that very first afternoon at the creek, had never once failed to see the whole of Clara Whitmore. She kept her promise in the end, just not the one she thought she'd made. If Clara and Thomas's story moved you even half as much as it moved me writing it, I'd be so grateful if you'd hit that subscribe button before you go. There are so many more stories like this one waiting to be told. Stories about love that dares to happen later than expected, deeper than expected, braver than anyone gives it credit for. Leave a comment and tell me what part of their story stayed with you the longest. I read every single one, and I'll see you in the next story.